The International Association for Near-Death Studies presents NDE Radio, a weekly exploration of near-death experiences and similar encounters with the other side. Now, here's your host, Lee Witting.
What if our lives after death are just as complex and soul-searching as our lives on Earth? What if we carry notions of religion and behavior with us as a true karmic burden, and all the answers we receive at death are colored by our karmic assumptions as well as by the light? Welcome to NDE Radio, brought to you by the International Association for Near-Death Studies. I'm your host, Lee Witting. Today's guest on the show is Kienda Betrue Valbracht, who had a near-death experience at birth, only to recall the details of it years later. Her involvement with death and afterlife studies was later heightened by the tragic loss of her infant son, Christian Alexander, to sudden infant death syndrome in 1982. Today, Kienda is a clinical hypnotherapist specializing in past life, death, and rebirth sessions. She is the author of the book Lucid Death, Conscious Journeys Beyond the Threshold, about which Amazon comments that the author communicates how life and death are seen as both universal and intimately personal, and she shares spiritual regressions that provide living images of life and death and karma and reincarnation, including the wisdom traditions of a variety of world religions. Lucid Death offers a spiritual truth or spiritual truths and tools for accomplishing life and death in noble, enlightened, and empowered ways. Kienda, welcome to NDE Radio.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you.
Kienda, perhaps you could begin by telling us about how you learned about your own NDE and how your interest in past life regressions evolved.
Oh, yes, I definitely can. Well, as you mentioned, my near-death experience happened at birth. There were complications, and I was dying at the moment until a little nurse noticed that things were not well. And I didn't actually realize what that had been and what it had meant until I was probably in my 40s, and I was going through a session of peer counseling, whereupon the whole birth experience and the journey into the spiritual world and then the return came very clear in my mind. I relived it in that moment. But in realizing that made sense of certain aspects of my personality and myself, which had been present since my earliest childhood memories, which was that I could see the elementals and the little fairies and things like that. And many children do see them, but they don't usually remember, whereas I remembered, and it was somewhat ongoing. And my interest at a very early age in spirituality. In northern Minnesota, that was only just a regular church, but asking the minister serious questions as a child, those kinds of things all began to make sense when I realized that my birth was complicated by death in the same moment.
Mm.
And
And when did you decide to pursue this as a career?
Well, that actually happened later on when there was a period of time, and often people have this, where death comes in waves. My father, my brother, and then my infant son died. And when he died, I already had quite an extensive background in, I would say, the esoteric and cosmic aspects of Christianity and the fundamental, what are the words here? The fundamental background of spiritual understandings throughout history, actually. And so that impelled me into actually wanting to seriously understand what death was. And where my son had gone and what was actually going on. It happened in 1982, and so I hadn't actually in a sense, developed my own practices for exploration into the spiritual world. But there is a path in which one can actually safely navigate the spiritual world, the many different spiritual realms that there are, and return with answers to questions. It's something that the ancient religions of all times and the ancient initiation processes of, say, all the ancient cultures that involved shamanism or involved the high priests that would journey into the spiritual world, that's always been a part of human evolution and development. Mm-hmm. But in the 1980s, there were no hierophants. There were no masters who would take a neophyte through those journeys. So I, in a way, had to take the basis of what I had learned in meditative practices, in prayer, in my reading of all the different world's religions, and then develop something within myself that could actually allow me to explore the various realms. And once I had the discipline for that, I was able to be in communication with my son, so that he actually, even in the acknowledgments in my book, I say that it's Christian Alexander, my son, who died of SID many years ago. I wrote the book, actually, it was my master's thesis, which I got in 2000, that he was actually the co-author of the book, because he was a constant companion. And in the beginning, he would, in a sense, I could almost see as though he pulled aside the veil between the layers and the levels and the dimensions of the world, so that I might then enter, communicate, ask, perceive, hear, and sense what was actually occurring in those worlds.
Now, do you think that Christian Alexander had a hand in leading you to study Rudolf Steiner?
That had already happened, but I do think that we work together in the spiritual world before we are all incarnated. We always meet before we come down, and we make agreements, and we realize, oh, this will work for this lifetime. How about we try this or that or the other thing? And I think we all, it was definitely my destiny to find anthroposophy and the work of Rudolf Steiner in this lifetime, yes. And so he being such an intimate part of my life, he also had his hand in that, I'm sure. Mm. All my children did. They went to the Waldorf schools, and they've had, I homeschooled two of my daughters, two of my three, and we did, like the homeschooling lessons that we took on were just not the usual things, but also included like studying the series of books of the lives and the lives and teaching of the masters of the Far East, or The Great Initiates by Edouard Chouret, or Rudolf Steiner is a little hard to tackle. It has to be worked through for quite a few years before one can actually even speak coherently about the work, actually, because it's rather vast. And but my girls have had a pretty good background in all of those kinds of things. And so they, nicely, they went from homeschool to community college on the dean's list. Human beings are wonderfully intelligent beings, if they are given the chance to really explore all aspects of that. At any rate.
Well, one of the interesting things about Steiner, as far as I know, and I'm not that familiar with his work, but that he was trying to reconcile spirituality and science, two instruments toward the pursuit of truth, which, I personally believe have to ultimately come together, because if you've got two different directions going toward truth, ultimately they're going to have to meet somewhere out there.
True.
And am I right in saying that this was one of his interests?
Yes, Steiner began, he was a philosopher in the colleges, the universities of the time in Vienna, and he also then, in those days, science had not taken such a very, hadn't gone so terribly deeply into just materialism and the, how shall we say, the rejection of the spirit as antithetical. In his day, which was the turn of the century, the 1900s, the education included things like philosophy. That was considered the science of the thinking mind, the science of thought. And so he was schooled in that extensively. And the other aspects of science itself in the outer world were still much more, in a sense, mobile, because he became the archivist of Johann Goethe, Wolfgang von Goethe's work, who was an early scientist. Excuse me. He worked with the science of light, but the metamorphosis aspect and the spiritual interpenetration into the physical was still present in human thought at that time. And so Rudolf Steiner had what was the best scientific background, but also philosophical and didactics and language and all those, the old classics as well. So Rudolf Steiner was an initiate, and an initiate is one who has received a training by which they can enter the spiritual world. As I said before, the ancient mysteries of all schools, the Samothrace and the Ephesian mysteries and the Mongolian mysteries and South American mysteries, there were these mystery schools in the early times in which those human beings who had the potential were carefully schooled and disciplined in practices and tools that would lead them to be able to explore the spiritual worlds. By the time humanity had come into the 18th and the 19th centuries, there were that ability to easily perceive what was occurring in the spiritual world was beginning to dim as humanity was learning to think clearly and logically and sequentially, so that science then would have its time in which we could, with our human mind, penetrate into the workings and the depths of matter. But when that happened, we lost the ability to see so clearly into the spiritual world. Now, there's been a change since actually the time of Steiner. If you recall, back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there was this huge wave of spiritualism in America, and there was the Theosophical Society developed. And these were people who were now beginning to use their mind to penetrate into the spiritual world, whereas before it had just been the gift. And the mind was just put into physical materiality, actually. So Rudolf Steiner was initiated into the mysteries of the blending and balancing and the interpenetration of spirit and matter. And the way he worked in his lifetime was, as other people, normal people approached, and they would have a question about say, just as an example, a number of farmers from Prussia, I believe it was, came to speak to Rudolf Steiner because they said, our Earth is no longer yielding what it used to, and it doesn't seem to have the vitality that it once had. And what can we do to re-enliven the Earth herself? What can human beings do? And out of that, biodynamic farming practices were brought forth by Steiner, in that he explored into the spiritual world what it would take to do that. And so biodynamic is another step beyond organic, actually.
What was Findhorn connected with Steiner thinking?
Not as such, but the people were well aware of Steiner's work as well, yes.
Oh, I see. Now, he had some enemies, didn't he? He was attacked during his lifetime. What was that about?
Actually. Well, now we must go into something that many people in this day and age are not happy to think of, and that is that there are actually forces of evil working in the world. Not just human beings. Human beings are pawns in the game, actually. Human beings, if we think of all the other animals, or if we think of what the angels are, or we think of what the elementals are, they don't do the things that human beings are sometimes tempted to do. And normally, human beings are loving and kind and communal, and we live in family groups, and we nurture our young, and we are creative, and all of those things. Those are really more the heart of the human being, what humanity is. But then there are the serial killers and psychopaths, and then there are, those, I would have to say, when we look at our cultures and society, those who are in positions of power, who take advantage of that. Those, I'm not really sure that those are human attributes. Are those perhaps human beings who have fallen prey to actually spiritual beings antithetical to human evolution? Well, I need to say at this point just one thing, and that is when I began to study death, and I took it on as my master's thesis, the first thing I realized was, I'm not going to understand death if I do not understand life. So I had to put together for myself a conceptual matrix of the evolution of humankind. And I did a lot of reading in the Hindu world, in Theosophy itself, in the Buddhist world, in Rosicrucianism, in Rudolf Steiner as one of the latest initiate of our times. And I put together, I had to take that on before I could even take on death, which was, what is life all about? Why are we here? Where are we headed? And what are the forces that are working in opposition to the graceful fulfillment of our human destiny? And when you bring up this subject of how Rudolf Steiner himself was attacked, it was because the dark side, or the oppositional side, would prefer that human beings not achieve their destiny, to become as they are destined to become. And they also function in the evolution of humankind with a backward sort of hand, in that in learning to stand and perceive and understand and discern and then choose our actions, that is very helpful for human evolution. It's just that it is a very difficult, what shall we say, challenges. So yes, unfortunately, Rudolf Steiner moved into, people I know have heard of the Waldorf school, Waldorf education.
Yes,
that arose because Rudolf Steiner was asked to found a school for the workers of a particular factory. And out of that came Waldorf education. And there's anthroposophical medicine, which makes use of homeopathic dilutions of different materials and different metals which had not been used before in medicine. And let's see, there's a painting. There's a whole school of painting which has to do with laying down different veils of color. And there's a whole school of architecture. And so Rudolf Steiner was bringing the spiritual impulse into normal daily human life and the workings of our culture and our worlds and our societies, and the forces that are in opposition to that would prefer to keep humanity down in one form, fascism or another, they were definitely antithetical to Rudolf Steiner's work.
Now, one of the interesting facets of your book, Lucid Death, is the fact that you go into the complexity not only of life but also of death, and it really brings into question the, let's, for a simple shorthand, call it a new age concept that when we cross over, the simple assumption is that we just go into the light and all our limited perceptions are answered and we have no more questions. And yet, I would say your book indicates that personal beliefs and karma could play a more complex role in what happens next and what we experience when we die. And, of course, Jesus said, "My Father's house has many mansions." So what accounts for all these differences? And is it as complex on the other side as it is here?
Yes, I believe that it is, actually. And possibly even more so because there are many different dimensions that, many more than are here on the physical plane. Well, and so right now I can just run through very briefly. The one of the keys to understanding the conceptual matrix of life and death was the understanding that a human being is more than just the physical body. I mean, I can't see you, so I don't even see your physical body, but we are talking, and so there's another aspect of ourselves that can actually communicate. You're thinking, obviously, because you're asking intelligent questions, and hopefully I'm answering in an intelligent manner. And so that's an aspect of every human being that exists but is not seen and is not on the physical plane. And then you're having emotions. You might be excited about something, or maybe something sad has happened in your life, and you carry that with you even in this conversation. And I have my emotions, and so that's another aspect of the human being that cannot be seen but exists. And I think you and I are sharing little bits of that, even in our conversation over, thousands of miles away. And
yes.
You're alive. You're not just like a rock lying there. Your body isn't just a physical thing that lies, bound to the earth as all the minerals are. So there's something that in you is living. So the way that this is using an esoteric language, but it's also based on many of the ancient Hindu concepts, and there are many new things that are being discovered about these various aspects of the human being. But let me just put it into the language of the physical is the simple. Every part of the periodic table, the oxygen, the carbon, the silica, all these different parts that make up the physical body of the earth, the stones and everything that is physical material. And human beings have their physical bodies. And the main law of the physical world is gravity. Therefore, all of those things, including our physical body, lie on the ground and don't simply get up and walk away, only downward. But how do, say, the plants bring the carbon and the silica and everything? How does plants get those minerals up into their forms? They have an etheric body or a life body or a vital body. And the main law of that realm, which we cannot see, but we see symptoms of it, the main law of that realm is levity or uprisingness. Basically, it is the gravity from the sun, which pulls upward. And the templates for all material existence is held in the etheric worlds. And it has a touch point on the physical with the DNA. So the DNA is one of those physical material things that bridges the gap to the template of how the material will be created to be a human being or a plant or an animal. And humans, animals, and plants all have etheric bodies. The next higher level of evolution would be the animals. And they have a physical body, an etheric body, because they are upright. And they also have an emotional body or an astral body or a feeling body. Now, the main hallmark of that realm of existence is color. And it's feeling and emotion and expression. And animals, they all bond and they do all those kinds of things. They, however, do not have individuality in the terms of they are a species. Each animal is a part of a species. When we come to a human being, we have physical bodies, etheric bodies, astral bodies, where we have our feelings and people can see auras, and that's an outer expression of the emotional state of the individual. But we also have a higher member, which is as different from the astral body as the astral is from the etheric and the etheric from the physical, and that is, in the classical terms, the ego I, the individual spark of consciousness that can say, I, and that can conceptualize and extrapolate the higher principles out of physical, material, daily activities. We who, when we look at the stars, can see the worlds that are there. So those are the four parts then of the human being. Well, they have developed over long millennia of time. And one of the interesting things I discovered then, so once I had this understanding of how the evolution of the human being had developed from ancient times through varying stages of development of these varying aspects of ourselves, and how the ego I, the consciousness, has also gone through long periods of development of mere sentience or intellectuality, where the mind actually began to function, and now into the higher mentation that we can do, where we can imagine and visualize and spiritually journey into other worlds. Now we can do so consciously. And we
Kienda?
Yes?
We are just about out of time for today, but I want to extend an invitation to you to come back next week, if that would be all right, because we haven't even touched on past life regressions, and I would really love to hear about your work in that. So perhaps we could set up a time, and we'll talk after the show. But in the meantime, tell the folks how they can find your book, so that perhaps they'll buy it and read it before next week's show.
Yes. All right. That would be wonderful. Yes, because then I can explain the resolution of life in death. Well, yes, my book can be found on Amazon. Actually, you could order it through Barnes and Noble. Yes, Lucid Death: Conscious Journeys Beyond the Threshold. And my pen name is Kienda Betrue, Betrue, Betrue. And I have a
very
website,
good.
www.kiendavalbracht.com. KiendaValbracht.com. That's KiendaValbracht.com.
Kienda, thank you so much. And we'll talk again next Monday.
Yes.
For the folks out there, if they'd like to listen to this show again or any of our past shows, just go to our website at nderadio.org. And for more information about the work of IANDS, check out their website, iands.org. And tune in next Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern, for more NDE Radio. This is Lee Witting saying thanks for listening.